In the cold, pre-dawn darkness of October 31st, 1944, 4 young women were led from their cells at Dachau concentration camp and marched toward a secluded execution ground. They were British Special Operations executive agents who had parachuted into occupied France to organize resistance, sabotage German operations, and gather intelligence. They had been captured, interrogated, tortured, and held in brutal conditions for months. Now, on Halloween morning, the Nazi SS would execute them together, shooting each woman in the back of the neck before their bodies were burned in the camp crematorium. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were among Britain's most dangerous women spies, trained killers who had operated behind enemy lines, coordinated sabotage operations that destroyed German infrastructure, organized resistance networks that tied down thousands of enemy troops, and gathered intelligence that saved Allied lives. The Nazis feared them, and that fear manifested in the decision to execute them rather than hold them as prisoners of war. The story of how these 4 women came to die together on that October morning reveals the extraordinary courage of individuals who volunteered for missions with survival odds that were brutally low, the ruthless efficiency of the Nazi security apparatus that hunted them, and the terrible price paid by those who fought in the shadows of occupied Europe. To understand why these 4 women were executed together at Dachau, and why their deaths represented such a significant loss to British intelligence operations, we must first comprehend the context in which the Special Operations Executive operated and the unique role that women played in this clandestine organizations. The SOE was created in July 1940 on Winston Churchill's orders with the explicit mission to set Europe ablaze, to conduct sabotage, espionage, and support resistance movements in territories occupied by Nazi Germany. This was irregular warfare, operating outside the conventional rules of military engagement, employing deception, assassination, sabotage, and subversion to weaken German control and support local resistance organizations. The decision to employ women as SOE agents was initially controversial within British military and intelligence circles. Traditional military thinking held that women were unsuited for combat operations, that they lacked the physical strength and psychological hardness necessary for clandestine warfare, and that sending women into occupied territory where capture meant torture and death was morally questionable. However, the SOE leadership recognized that women possessed certain operational advantages that made them valuable, in some cases superior, to male agents for specific missions in occupied France. Women could move more freely through occupied territory because they attracted less suspicion from German security forces. A woman riding a bicycle through the French countryside or traveling on trains was far less likely to be stopped and questioned than a military-age man who should have been either working for the Germans or in a labor camp. Women could serve as couriers, carrying messages, money, and equipment between resistance cells without arousing the level of suspicion that male couriers faced. Moreover, the SOE needed agents who could blend into French society, who could pass as ordinary French citizens going about their daily lives while actually coordinating resistance operations. Many British women had French language skills, French ancestry, or had lived in France before the war, giving them cultural knowledge and linguistic fluency that made them ideal for insertion into occupied territory. The women recruited into SOE were not chosen for physical strength, but for intelligence, courage, language skills, ability to think quickly under pressure, and willingness to accept missions where the odds of survival were perhaps 1 in 2 at best. These were extraordinary individuals, women who volunteered knowing they might be captured, tortured, and killed, but who believed that defeating Nazi Germany justified any personal risk. The training these women underwent was rigorous and comprehensive, designed to prepare them for every aspect of clandestine operations. They learned silent killing techniques, how to use various weapons including pistols, submachine guns, and explosives, how to pick locks and crack safes, how to maintain cover identities under interrogation, how to recognize surveillance and evade capture, how to recognize and manage resistance networks, how to encode and decode messages networks, and dozens of other skills necessary for survival and operational effectiveness in occupied territory. The training was physically demanding and psychologically intense, designed to weed out those who lacked the mental toughness necessary for the work. Those who completed training were among the most capable and dangerous covert operatives Britain possessed. The 4 women executed together at Dachau on October 31, 1944, were Noor Inayat Khan, Yolande Beekman, Eliane Plewman, and Madeleine Damerment. Each had a unique background, each had demonstrated extraordinary courage, and each had made significant contributions to Allied operations before their capture. Their stories reveal both the remarkable achievements of SOE women agents and the terrible dangers they faced. Noor Inayat Khan was perhaps the most unlikely spy in the history of espionage. Born in Moscow in 1914 to an Indian Sufi father and an American mother, she had been raised in Paris in a household dedicated to music, spirituality, and pacifist principles. She was a published children's author, a musician who played the harp, and a deeply spiritual person whose religious beliefs emphasized nonviolence and compassion. She seemed temperamentally unsuited for the brutal realities of clandestine warfare. Yet, when France fell and her family fled to Britain, Khan volunteered for service, initially training as a wireless operator in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force before being recruited by the SOE. Her fluent French, her knowledge of Paris, and her wireless skills made her valuable despite serious concerns about her suitability for field operations. Her training instructors noted that she was clumsy, impractical, and seemed to lack the hardness necessary for the work. She was openly honest, a trait admirable in civilian life, but potentially fatal for a spy who needed to lie convincingly. Several instructors recommended she be dropped from training, yet she persisted, driven by determination to fight against Nazi occupation, and eventually she was deemed ready for deployment. In June 1943, Khan was parachuted into occupied France to serve as a wireless operator for the Prosper Network, one of the largest SOE circuits operating in France. She arrived at a catastrophic moment. Within weeks of her insertion, the Prosper Network was penetrated and destroyed by German security forces. Dozens of agents were arrested, radio operators were captured, and the entire organization collapsed. Khan suddenly found herself the only functioning SOE wireless operator in Paris, the most dangerous city in occupied France for clandestine operations. She was ordered to return to Britain, as her survival in Paris seemed impossible. She refused, arguing that her radio was the only link between London and resistance operations in the Paris region, and that abandoning her post would cripple SOE operations in northern France. For 3 months, Khan operated alone in Paris, constantly moving between safe houses, transmitting messages under the noses of German direction, finding teams that were actively hunting her, maintaining the vital communication link that allowed London to coordinate with resistance forces. It was an extraordinary display of courage and determination from someone her training instructors had deemed unsuitable for field operations. In October 1943, Khan was betrayed, either by a French collaborator or possibly by a captured SOE agent who had been turned. She was arrested by the Gestapo at her safe house. During her arrest, she fought back physically, scratching and clawing at her captors before being subdued. This was not the behavior of the gentle, spiritual woman her family had known, but of someone who had been transformed by war into a fighter willing to resist to the end. After her capture, Khan was interrogated intensively. The Gestapo wanted her codes, her contacts, and information about other SOE operations. She refused to cooperate. She attempted to escape twice, once from Gestapo headquarters in Paris and later from a prison, demonstrating a determination that belied her instructors' concerns about her suitability for field work. Her repeated escape attempts led to her being classified as highly dangerous, and she was eventually transferred to Germany, where she was held in chains at Pforzheim prison in solitary confinement for 10 months before being transferred to Dachau for execution. Yolande Beekman was a wireless operator who had been born in Paris to a Swiss father and a French mother, giving her perfect French language skills and deep knowledge of French culture. She had escaped to Britain after France's fall and joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force before being recruited by SOA. Beekman was described by those who knew her as quiet, efficient, and unflappable under pressure, exactly the temperament needed for the high-stress work of a wireless operator in occupied territory. She was parachuted into France in September 1943 and worked as a wireless operator for networks in northern France. Her ability to transmit messages quickly and accurately, to maintain her radio security protocols under pressure, and to evade German direction-finding efforts made her an invaluable asset to resistance operations. She operated successfully for 3 months before being arrested in January 1944, likely as a result of betrayal by someone within the resistance network who had been captured and broken under interrogation. Like Khan, Beekman refused to cooperate with her interrogators, providing no useful information despite the torture and threats she faced. She was held at Fresnes prison near Paris before being transferred to Germany and eventually to Dachau. Eliane Plewman was born in Marseille to a French mother and British father, giving her dual nationality and making her a natural candidate for SOE operations in France. She had lived in Britain before the war and spoke English without accent, but her French was equally fluent and she understood French culture intimately. She was recruited as a courier, a role that required moving between different resistance cells, carrying messages, money, weapons, and instructions, coordinating activities between groups that were kept separated for security reasons. Couriers faced extraordinary danger because they were constantly on the move, constantly exposed to potential German checkpoints and identity checks, constantly at risk of being followed or betrayed. Plewman was parachuted into France in August 1943 and operated in the Marseille region, where she worked with her husband Albert, also an SOE agent. The couple organized sabotage operations, coordinated arms drops, and helped build resistance networks in southern France. In March 1944, both Eliane and Albert were arrested after being betrayed by a double agent who had infiltrated their network. Albert was imprisoned and later executed. Eliane was sent to Fresnes prison, where she was held with other captured SOE agents before being transferred to Germany. Madeleine Damerment was perhaps the unluckiest of the 4 captured almost immediately upon arrival in France. She had been born in France and lived in Britain, working as a secretary before being recruited by SOE as a courier. She underwent full training and was prepared for insertion into France to work with resistance networks. In February 1944, She was parachuted into France, along with 2 other agents. However, the reception committee that met them had been compromised. German security forces had captured the committee and were using them in a radio game, a deception operation where captured agents' radios were used under German control to lure additional agents into traps. Damerment and her companions parachuted directly into German hands and were arrested immediately. She had not even had the opportunity to begin her mission before being captured. Despite this immediate capture and despite having minimal operational information that could have been of use to the Germans, she was held, interrogated, and eventually executed along with the others. Her execution demonstrated that the Nazis made no distinction between agents who had been operationally effective and those who had barely begun their work. Simply being an SOE agent was sufficient to warrant execution. These 4 women, with their different backgrounds and different operational histories, shared several common characteristics that explain why they were executed together. First, they were all SOE agents, members of an organization that the Nazis considered outside the laws of war. The Germans did not view SOE agents as soldiers entitled to prisoner of war status under the Geneva Conventions. They considered them spies, saboteurs, and terrorists who operated outside the rules of civilized warfare, and who therefore deserved no protection under international law. This perspective was formalized in Hitler's Commando Order of October 1942, which directed that all Allied commandos and special operations personnel captured behind German lines were to be handed over to the SD, the security service, for execution, regardless of whether they were in uniform, regardless of whether they had been captured in combat, and regardless of any claim to prisoner of war status. Second, these 4 women had all demonstrated extraordinary courage and determination, refusing to cooperate with their interrogators despite torture and threats. The Gestapo and SD interrogators had spent months trying to break these women, trying to extract information about other agents, about codes and procedures, about planned operations and resistance networks. The women had resisted, providing either no information or false information designed to mislead. This resistance was remarkable given the methods the Gestapo employed. Physical torture, including beatings, electric shocks, and waterboarding, was common. Psychological torture, including threats against families, mock executions, and extended solitary confinement, was standard. Sleep deprivation, starvation, and disease were deliberately employed to break prisoners' will. Yet these 4 women had resisted, demonstrating a strength of character that impressed even their captors while also convincing the Germans that they were too dangerous to keep alive. Third, these women were being held at a time when Germany's strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly. By October 1944, Allied forces had liberated France, were advancing toward Germany's borders, and were clearly winning the war. The Nazi leadership knew that war crimes trials would follow Germany's defeat. There was a growing recognition that captured Allied personnel, particularly those who had been tortured or mistreated, would serve as witnesses in those trials. Executing these prisoners eliminated witnesses who could testify about Gestapo methods, about specific interrogators, about the treatment of captured agents. It was both revenge against those who had harmed Germany's interests and a crude attempt to eliminate evidence of war crimes. The conditions these women endured between their capture and execution were horrific. Initially, most were held at Fresnes prison near Paris, a facility used by the Germans for political prisoners and captured resistance members. Fresnes was overcrowded, filthy, and disease-ridden. Prisoners were held in small cells, often in solitary confinement, with minimal food and no medical care. Interrogations were frequent and brutal. Then, as Allied forces advanced toward Paris in summer 1944, the women were transferred to Germany, traveling in cattle cars under conditions of extreme deprivation. They were held at various prisons before final transfer to Dachau, one of the Nazi concentration camp system's oldest and most notorious facilities. Dachau, located near Munich, had been established in 1933, making it one of the first concentration camps. By 1944, it had evolved into a vast complex where political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews and others deemed enemies of the Reich were held in brutal conditions. Tens of thousands would die there from disease, starvation, medical experiments, and execution. The 4 SOE women were held separately from the main camp population, which suggests they were marked for special treatment from the moment they arrived. They were held in cells, possibly in the bunker, the camp's prison block where special prisoners and those scheduled for execution were kept. On the night of October 30th, 1944, or in the early morning hours of October 31st, the 4 women were taken from their cells. We cannot know what they were told or what they knew about their fate. It is possible they were told they were being transferred to another facility, a common German deception technique. It is equally possible they knew they were going to their execution. They were led to a secluded area of the camp, to the crematorium complex where executions were routinely carried out. The method of execution was shooting, specifically shooting in the back of the neck, the genics just favored by the SS for its efficiency. Each woman was made to kneel. A single shot was fired into the base of her skull, and she died instantly or nearly so. The 4 bodies were then burned in the camp crematorium, eliminating physical evidence of the executions. The fact that all 4 were executed together on the same day suggests this was a coordinated decision made at a high level, possibly in Berlin by the Reich Security Main Office, which controlled the SD and oversaw the treatment of captured special operations personnel. It was not a random act by local camp command, but a deliberate execution of prisoners who had been selected specifically because of who they were and what they represented. The choice of October 31st as the execution date has led to the observation that these women were executed on Halloween morning, though whether this date had any significance to their executors is unknown. More likely, the date reflected administrative convenience, a schedule determined by when orders were received, when the camp commandant was available to sign the necessary authorization, and when the crematorium had capacity to handle the bodies. The deaths of these 4 women were not discovered immediately. In the chaos of the final months of the war, with Allied forces advancing and German record-keeping breaking down, the fate of many SOE agents who had been captured and transported to Germany remained unknown for months after war's end. It was only through painstaking investigation after Germany's defeat, through examination of captured German records, through interviews with survivors who had been imprisoned at the same facilities, and through matching incomplete records with known disappearances, that the truth began to emerge. British investigators traced the 4 women's paths from their capture in France, through French prisons, through transport to Germany, through various German facilities, to Dachau, where the trail ended with terse notation in camp records of executions carried out on October 31st, 1944. The investigation revealed not just the fate of these 4 women, but of dozens of other SOE agents, both male and female, who had been executed by the Nazis in the final years of the war. Some had been executed at other concentration camps, including Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen. Others had been executed at Gestapo facilities in France or Germany. The pattern was clear. The Nazi security apparatus had made a systematic decision to execute captured SOE personnel rather than hold them as prisoners, in direct violation of international law and the Geneva Conventions. This decision reflected both the Nazis' contempt for international law and their fear of the SOE's effectiveness in organizing and supporting resistance. The executions at Dachau and the execution of these 4 women specifically became evidence in war crimes trials held after the war. German officials involved in the capture, imprisonment, and execution of SOE agents were prosecuted for war crimes. Some were executed, others imprisoned. The trials established important precedents about the treatment of special operations personnel and about the applicability of Geneva Convention protections to irregular warfare participants. The trials confirmed that even if one accepted the German argument that SOE agents were not conventional soldiers, they were still entitled to basic protections under international law, including the right not to be tortured and the right to some form of judicial process before execution. The story of these 4 women and their execution at Dachau has become an important part of how Britain remembers World War II and the contributions of women to victory. After the war, all 4 women were recognized for their service and their sacrifice. Noor Inayat Khan was posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian decoration for gallantry. The citation noted her courage in continuing to operate in Paris after the collapse of her network, her refusal to cooperate with her captors despite torture, and her repeated escape attempts. Yolande Beekman, Eliane Plewman, and Madeleine Damerment were also recognized with awards acknowledging their service. Memorials have been erected honoring them and other SOE agents who died in Nazi custody. Their names are inscribed on monuments, schools and streets have been named after them, and books and films have told their stories to new generations. Yet beyond the official recognition and the memorials, the story of these 4 women raises profound questions about courage, sacrifice, and the nature of warfare. These were young women, several still in their 20s, who had their entire lives ahead of them. They volunteered for missions where survival was uncertain at best. They operated in occupied territory where capture meant torture and likely death. They persisted despite fear, despite loneliness, despite the constant stress of maintaining false identities and evading enemy security forces. When captured, they resisted interrogation despite brutal treatment, and when executed they faced death with courage that impressed even their executioners. What drove such extraordinary courage? What enabled them to continue operating even when the odds became hopeless? What allowed them to resist under torture when cooperation might have saved their lives? Part of the answer lies in ideology and commitment to cause. These women genuinely believed that Nazi Germany represented an existential threat to civilization, that defeating Germany justified any personal sacrifice, and that their individual contributions, however small they might seem, could help save lives and hasten victory. They had seen Nazi occupation, had witnessed German brutality, and had understood that this was a fight for survival not just of their nation, but of the values and freedoms they held dear. This conviction gave them strength to face dangers that would paralyze most people. Part of the answer lies in training and preparation. The SOE training system was designed to forge individuals who could function under extreme stress, who could maintain operational effectiveness despite fear and exhaustion, who could think clearly and act decisively when most people would freeze. The training created a kind of professional identity, a sense of oneself as a covert operative capable of extraordinary things. This professional identity sustained them through the worst moments, allowing them to draw on reserves of strength they might not have known they possessed. Part of the answer lies in character and individual psychology. These were exceptional individuals before they ever joined SOE. They possessed qualities of determination, resilience, intelligence, and courage that marked them as extraordinary even in a generation that faced extraordinary challenges. The war gave them opportunity to express these qualities, to test themselves against the ultimate challenges, to discover what they were capable of when everything was at stake. The execution of these 4 women together at Dachau on October 31, 1944, represented a defeat for the Nazi security apparatus, even as it represented a tragedy for British intelligence and a personal catastrophe for the women and their families. The Nazis had tried to break these women, to force them to betray their comrades and their cause. They had failed. The women had resisted to the end, maintaining their cover stories or remaining silent, providing no useful intelligence, compromising no other agents. The Nazi response to this failure was execution, an admission that they could not break these women and an expression of fear about what these women represented. By executing them, the Nazis acknowledged that these were not ordinary prisoners who could be broken or turned, but dangerous opponents who posed a threat even in captivity. The legacy of Noor Inayat Khan, Yolande Beekman, Eliane Plewman, and Madeleine Damerment extends beyond their individual contributions to the war effort. They became symbols of female capability in warfare, demonstrating that women could serve effectively in the most dangerous military roles. They challenged assumptions about gender and combat that had persisted for centuries. They proved that courage, intelligence, and determination were not gendered qualities, but human qualities that could be found in anyone, regardless of sex. Their service and their sacrifice helped open doors for subsequent generations of women who wanted to serve in military and intelligence roles, providing evidence that women could meet the same standards and face the same dangers as men. In the cold pre-dawn of October 31, 1944, 4 young women died at Dachau, executed by a regime that feared what they represented and sought to silence them forever. Yet their silence after death has proven more powerful than any testimony they might have given in life. Their courage, their determination, and their willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause they believed in has inspired countless others. They remain among Britain's most dangerous women spies not because of any single spectacular operation, but because of their sustained effectiveness under impossible conditions, their refusal to break even under the worst treatment imaginable, and their demonstration that the human spirit, when committed to a just cause, can endure and resist even in the face of absolute evil. That is why we remember them, why we honor them, and why their story continues to resonate 8 decades after they died together on Halloween morning at Dachau.